with Stephen, and he will give us a lot of information. He promises things that aren't on the internet that we don't know about.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you very much. Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, I mean, it's a very bizarre turn of events that have led me to be here. When you get an email from someone claiming to have a photography center in America, but you know nothing about them, I was sort of slightly worried I was going to be kidnapped. But as it turns out, I haven't been. So thank you very much for not kidnapping me, John. And thank you for having me, Casey. Are you going to do that for the whole thing? Because that's going to freak me out. Okay. No. Okay. I'm done. Okay. So a little bit about myself. Like John said, I am a writer and a photographer from London, and I do a YouTube channel where I talk about my favourite photographs and favourite photographers, one of whom is Walker Evans. And so I'm going to do, if you've seen that film, I don't know, has anyone here seen that film? Great, good, that's good. So I've sort of augmented that and done a bit more. I never knew there would be a children's band playing, so I'll try and speak up. And if anyone needs me to speak up or repeat anything, please just say. And hopefully I won't get lost in my own lecture, because for some reason I can't see the number of the slide. So we'll soldier on and see where we get to. So Walker Evans. By the way, this photo that you can see here is Walker Evans having his breakfast in 1940, and for some reason he's got a curtain on his head. The exact reason why he's got a curtain on his head is now lost to the mist of time, but we do know for certain that this photo was taken by Walker Evans' friend and sometime collaborator, Helen Levitt, who was a great New York-based photographer in her own right. Here is a photograph of Helen Levitt taken by Walker Evans, possibly on the same day that he had the curtain on his head. And you can see Helen Levitt has not got a curtain on her head, but she has got a very stylish hat at a jaunty angle. And we'll come back to this photo and the exact story behind it a bit later on. But the reason that I'm showing these photos right at the start is because to me they sum up and encapsulate the problem and the immense panic I had when John asked me to do this lecture, which is, where the hell do you start with Walker Evans? Because he is so popular and has been written about so much, and there is so much information out there about Walker Evans, way too much. And so when I first started thinking about what the hell I was going to talk about today, part of me thought that actually what I could do was I could not talk about his photographs at all, but I could just talk about photographs of Walker Evans, because there are thousands of them. He was a very photogenic man, and unlike a lot of photographers, he didn't seem to mind having his photo taken. Unlike me, I hate having my photo taken, as you saw with Casey tried to take it just then. But you know, Evans actually seemed to quite like having his photo taken, and you know, so this is another photo of him with a curtain on his head, also taken by Helen Levitt. There's another one in that shot, and then here, you know, if you want to see any, you know, here's a selfie taken by Walker Evans when he was in his mid-20s in hospital in New York for an unnamed ailment, which no one's quite sure of what it was. This is a selfie, but he also allowed a lot of other photographers to take his photograph. Photographers that he knew who sort of flocked to him to take his photograph throughout his very long career. So here's a great photograph of him I like on a train, looking suitably annoyed and pissed off, or just exhausted, or possibly drunk. He never flew anywhere, Walker Evans. He never flew anywhere in his entire life. He only took trains, cars, buses, and cruise ships, as we'll come to discover. So this is by a friend of his and a photography collector extraordinaire called Arnold H. Crane from 1969. Here is a Polaroid of him towards the end of his life, where he's got an absolutely amazing beard, as you can see. He described himself as looking like a lean Santa Claus, which is by Bobby Carey. And here's a photo of him taken by Lee Freelander. This is in the 1950s, where he's taking a photograph of something else, presumably some kind of building. He took a lot of photographs of buildings, as you probably know. And Freelander took lots of photographs of Evans. In fact, there's a whole Lee Freelander book you can get just the photographs of Walker Evans. This is another one he took. You can see Evans is there in the middle taking a photograph of this ice cream place, which is in Taunton, Massachusetts. I don't know if it's still there, but because Evans never threw anything away. Everything that he shot is archivable and searchable online virtually. We can see that's the photograph he took while Lee Franlin is behind him taking this photograph, and this is the photograph that Evans took with his Polaroid SX70, which is, this is not the exact one, but a similar one. So, you know, this sort of hopefully gives you a kind of sense of the kind of panic I went in, because there's so much Evans stuff out there. It's like, what the hell do I talk about? But don't worry, I didn't decide to just show you photos of Walker Evans. I'm going to talk about his own photographs as well. But before I can do that properly, it strikes me that I probably need to give you a quick potted history of his life, or at least his early life, because I don't know how much people here know about Walker Evans. I didn't know too much about him when I started doing all this, but I certainly feel that I know him very well now after having read quite a few books. So Evans, and throughout this talk I'm going to refer to him just as Evans, not Walker, because I imagine he would have been considered me, a mere child who never met him, to be very presumptuous and over-familiar by using his first name. But anyway, Evans was born on November the 3rd, 1903 in St. Louis, Missouri, to a relatively well-to-do family. Here is a photo of him, that's him in the middle, with his father and his grandfather. And interestingly to me, Walker Evans was actually Walker Evans III. So his grandfather was Walker Evans, his father was Walker Evans Jr., which weirdly makes him Walker Evans III or Walker Evans Jr. Jr., depending on how you want to refer to him. And whilst this may be sort of clutching at straws a bit, I very much like the fact that a man who throughout his life did a lot of walking and reproducing things through photography was himself called Walker, and the third copy or iteration of a Walker Evans himself, which to me feels fitting. Or I might just be talking absolute nonsense. As you'll come to appreciate, I do a lot of speculation and talking absolute nonsense. But hopefully you'll begin to grasp what the hell I'm on about as I go on. Anyway, his father here, Walker Evans Jr., was an advertising executive who made his living writing copy and playing with words. And that's very important to remember because words and text, and as we'll come to see, fonts and signage in all their manifestations were very important to the younger Walker Evans, or Walker Jr. or Walker III or whatever he is, just as important as photography. So here he is again. He was born in St. Louis in 1903. He actually grew up in the Chicago suburb of Kenilworth, but the family moved several times. And it's important to note that his was a modestly privileged upbringing. He wasn't from a poor background at all. And he was the younger of two children. Here's a picture of him and his sister Jane, who was about a year older. And here's a picture that Evans took himself when he was 12 years old, which reads Albert, our butler and chauffeur, in 1915. So you can see he had a decent moneyed upbringing. And I mention this not to judge him, but I think it's an important fact to keep in mind as we come to learn more about the man and his subsequent life and his subsequent way of life, to understand where he came from and what informed him along the way. Because he wasn't a child of immense privilege, but he did move in certain circles, and he always aspired to and had a taste for finer things. So he went to various minor private secondary schools. His father moved the family around quite a bit for his job. Here is a photo of his parents from about 1915. 3 years after this photo was taken, his father left his wife for the woman next door. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the woman next door. But here is a photo of Evans's mother on her own, looking suitably hacked off at the behaviour of her husband, which she may have known about at the time, I don't know. Anyway, while she was still married to Walker Evans' father, Walker Evans was rejected by Yale and ended up going to Williams College in Williamstown, which Google Maps informs me is a mere hour and a half from up here, so just up the road in American terms. Anyway, while he was at college, he discovered a lifelong love of literature and writing, and especially European and French literature. He spoke French fluently, and he began to flaneur about. And if you don't know about flaneuring, I'll explain that as a concept in a little bit. And he decided that being a writer was what he actually wanted to do with his life. So what did he do? He dropped out of Williams College after just a year. And his parents had got divorced a few years earlier. And so in 1923, at the age of 19, almost 20, Evans went to live with his mother and sister in New York City. And in New York, the first job he got was in the map room of the New York Public Library. This is a photograph of the New York Public Library taken by Walker Evans in the 1940s, and this is another one of the reading room in the New York Public Library taken by Walker Evans. And this was for an unpublished commission for Vogue magazine in 1949. Fortunately or unfortunately for me, virtually everything that Evans did is online. His entire archive is at the Met Online Archive, and you can spend days, as I have, going through absolutely everything. So it's both good and bad, because if you rootle about enough, you can find it all. So even though he was now living in New York, he didn't really want to be there. What he wanted to do was go to Europe, or more specifically Paris, because he was obsessed with European literature and the old world, and he believed Paris to be the incandescent centre and the place to be. So what did he do? He apparently annoyed and begged his father and his estranged parents so much that and in his own words, took advantage of their distraction until his father agreed to pay for him and his mother to travel to Europe. And so on April the 6th, 1926, Walker Evans, then aged 22, and his mother, and possibly even his sister, although accounts vary, set out on a cruise ship for Cherbourg. And like I said, he never flew anywhere. So he arrived in Paris. Here's a photo of him in Paris on Christmas Day in 1926 in the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris. And the question that you might ask is, what did he do when he got there, after he begged his father to finance his trip? What did he do? Well, he didn't really do much, to be perfectly honest. He didn't try and seek out the artistic elite that he'd been dreaming of. You know, and Paris in the 1920s was the centre of literary culture. But Evans, very much, because he was still quite young, kept himself to himself. He didn't hang out with Hemingway, although he would do years later when he met Hemingway in Cuba. But this time he didn't hang out with him at all. He didn't hang out with any other writers. Apparently he caught a glimpse of James Joyce from a distance, but he didn't go and introduce himself. He didn't meet any of the French photographers like Atget, who he very much admired. He seems to have kept himself to himself, but he did start to develop his eye and improve his French, and it would obviously have pleased him to be in the birthplace of his literary heroes, because at this time he didn't consider himself to be a photographer at all, but his literary heroes were Gustave Flaubert and Charles Baudelaire. And I'm sure that no one here wants me to veer off and start discussing French literature, but it is worth briefly considering the irony that Walker Evans' literary hero was Charles Baudelaire, because Charles Baudelaire hated photography. He absolutely loathed it. He was quite famous for it. In 1859, he described photography as art's most mortal enemy. And despite this, Baudelaire did have his own photograph taken on several occasions. Here's a photograph of him, taken by Etienne Carjac in 1863. And you can see that Baudelaire is glowering at the camera with true Gallic disdain, worthy of the man who wrote that the photographic industry was the refuge of every would-be painter, every painter too ill-endowed or too lazy to complete his studies. This universal infatuation bore not only the mark of blindness and imbecility, but had the air of a vengeance. I do not believe, or at least I do not wish to believe, in the absolute success of such a brutish conspiracy, in which, as in all others, one finds both fools and knaves. But I am convinced that the ill-applied developments of photography, like all other purely material developments of progress, have contributed much to the impoverishment of the French artistic genius, which is already so scarce. So cheery and emphatic feelings from Charles Baudelaire there about photography. But then again, Baudelaire not only hated photography, he seems to have hated modern life in general, of which photography was just one example or manifestation. And it's important to keep in mind, because Evans, as we'll go on to discover, also was very uneasy with modern life, particularly his modern life, growing up between the wars in the 1920s and the 30s and then experiencing the Depression. So while Baudelaire hated photography because he could sense that it had the potential to usurp painting, what he did advocate, and what Evans seems to have spent a lot of time doing in Paris and Europe and then later on in America, was looking at stuff, staring and examining things closely. And a bit earlier on, I might have mentioned the concept of flaneuring. And this is what Baudelaire truly loved. He was a big promoter of this concept, which can loosely be translated as sauntering or wandering, or as we put it in England, poncing about without any specific destination or purpose. and it combines a seemingly contrasting mix of both idleness and curiosity, which is very apt when we talk about Evans. Another French writer, Balzac, described flaneuring as gastronomy of the eye, whatever that means. I have no idea. And my favourite Baudelaire quote on flaneuring is from an essay he wrote in 1863, the same year that he had this photo taken, called The Painter of Modern Life, in which he talks about a painter that he knows and quotes him talking about looking life and says, "The first thing to note is that curiosity may be considered the starting point of his genius. Curiosity had become a compelling, irresistible passion. For the perfect idler, for the passionate observer, it becomes an immense source of enjoyment to establish his dwelling in the throng, in the ebb and flow, the bustle, the fleeting and the infinite, to be away from home and yet to feel home anywhere, to see the world, to be at the very centre of the world and yet to be unseen of the world. Such are some of the minor pleasures of those independent, intense and impartial spirits who do not lend themselves easily to linguistic definitions." And that could almost be a blueprint for Evans himself and his life. A curious observer, someone eager to see the world and yet to be unseen of the world himself. Later in his life as a famous photographer, Evans was repeatedly heard to say to people, "Watch me disappear," and he would go and wander off into a crowd to take his photos. And it's undeniable that curiosity about all things, was his lifelong lodestar, one of the traits that defined him. So in Paris, and here's a self-portrait taken by Evans there in 1927, I want to speculate that Evans had a revelation. And his revelation was that he was never going to be a famous writer like his hero Balzac or Flaubert, but he could see another way forward, a comparatively new artistic direction that was photography, the very thing which Baudelaire hated, but which Evans was to think of as the most literary of the visual arts. And here, there's still a very few of the photographs that Evans started taking in Europe in existence. In an interview near the end of his life, he said that he had a vest pocket camera, which is like one of these collapsible brownies. They obviously are small and unobtrusive, hence the name. They could fit in your vest pocket, and they were cheap. They took 1/27 roll film, and whilst the quality of the image they made wasn't exactly incredible, it was enough to get the young Walker Evans hooked on photography, or at least the possibility of what photography could offer. And here are a few of the surviving photographs that he took in Paris in the late 1920s. There's one of, I think that might be a policeman, I'm not sure, looking at him. And then just some very sort of average shots of streets and stuff going on. And looking at these, you're probably thinking they're quite unremarkable. They're the images of someone experimenting with a new way of seeing, recording and making, but they're nothing special at all. And this too is fascinating to me because within just a few years of taking these unremarkable photos, Evans got back to New York in May 1927, and 3 years later he was already starting to call himself a professional photographer, and he had already taken some of the photographs that helped establish him as a major figure in American and world photography. Here's another photograph of him in a photo booth selfie from 1929, which I'm just going to leave up there for a short while to slowly disconcert and trouble you, because it looks like something out of a David Lynch film, but years before David Lynch. So that's a little bit about Evans's early life, and those of you who are still awake are probably thinking that what I'm going to go on and do now is continue to talk chronologically about what he did when he got back to America in 1927 and his subsequent photographic odyssey. But I'm not going to do that, or not directly at least. Instead, I'm going to come back to something I touched on earlier, which is the problem of what to talk about with Evans, because I don't want to give you just a straight, complete biography of his life, although hopefully it was useful for you to understand a little bit about his early life and his context. What I want to try and do is focus on a few of his photographs in particular in detail. But which ones? How do I decide which Evans photographs to talk about when he's got such an enormous archive and so many scholarly opinions out there that you can possibly imagine? The British Library has over 300 books just on Evans alone. If you go to Amazon, there are 281 listed books about him, not even his books, but just books about him. If you do a Google search for his name, you get millions and millions of pages. You know, photographs and articles are suddenly instantly available. You could drown. And you know, we're here now talking about him, which is, you know, bizarre in itself. He's undoubtedly one of the most significant and studied photographers of the 20th century, if not all time. So what on earth can I possibly find to say about him that hasn't been said already? What I could do is I could talk about Walker Evans and me. And what do I mean by that? I've never met him. He died when I was just 5 years old. So what possibly could link me and him? Well, you know, I live in London. I'm a photographer and a writer, although my father never paid for me to go and flounce about in Paris when I was in my early 20s. But back in 2002, there was a Walker Evans exhibition in London at the Photographer's Gallery. This is the Photographer's Gallery as it used to be. This is a lovely photograph by a really great photographer called Dorothy Baum, who was one of the people that founded the Photographer's Gallery, but that's by the by. And in 2002, I'd only been taking photographs for a very few years. I didn't really know much about it, and I didn't know anything about Walker Evans at all. But I went to that exhibition, I remember it very clearly, and it sort of got me hooked on his work and on his life. And it's when I first saw the photograph that I want to talk about at length today, which is this one. And this is the actual postcard from that exhibition back in 2002 in London. And I've still got it, and I remember it clearly because even though it was only about £1.50, I didn't buy it, I stole it. And I'll explain why that's significant in a minute, because it's not something I'm particularly proud of, but the fact that I stole it was a very Walker Evans thing to do, even though I didn't know it, and I'll try and explain why. So this is that photo in all its glory, which is damaged by Walker Evans, or to give it its full title, Workers Loading Neon Damage Sign into Truck, West 11th Street, New York City, 1928 to 1930. Which doesn't mean that it took them 2 years to load the sign onto the truck, but rather no one is exactly 100% certain when it was taken. And given that we've just discovered he only got back from Europe in 1927, this is definitely an early American Walker Evans photograph, and it's absolutely brilliant. You know, I never tire of looking at it, and I think it's one of my favourite photographs that he took and maybe that anyone's taken. And I'll try now to explain why this thing floats my boat so spectacularly. Where do we start with a photograph like this? Because on one level, it's just a great, lucky, unlikely photograph. You know, the photographic gods must have been really smiling down on Walker Evans when he stumbled across this. But I think the secret or the key to all great photographs is that they have some depth and some mystery to them. They make you ask questions, and that's certainly the case with this. The first thing to acknowledge is that this photograph plays a very clever trick on you, almost subconsciously, because you see the word damaged, and you initially believe that something is wrong with the sign. That maybe, you know, the fact that it's at an angle also makes you think that. It makes you assume that the damaged sign is itself damaged. But when you look closer, you realise that it's not. It's actually brand spanking new. It's perfect. The confusion stems from the way that Evans has photographed it. The workers struggling with this giant word could either be loading it onto the back of the truck or taking it off. Is it damaged and being taken away to be repaired, or is it new and being taken off to be installed somewhere? We're simply not sure. Evans took at least 3 different versions of the workers' attempt to load or unload this sign onto the truck. I don't have very good versions of the alternates, but even from the bad copies of these ones, you can get the idea, and you can see what he was aiming for. And the inherent ambiguity of each version is essential, I think, to the photograph's enduring power. If you look a bit closer, then there are some clues. The truck that they're loading it onto or off is for the Globe Electric Sign Corps. You can see there, I've highlighted it, on West 11th Street. And if you look at the shop front in the background, you can also see there that that is the Globe Electric Sign Corps. So the sign presumably has just been finished in their workshop, then taken out through these large double doors here, and it's being loaded onto the truck to being taken away. But where to? What was this huge sign for? What actually was damaged? Well, the truth is no one knows. There's some speculation that it was for a long-lost romantic comedy film that had come out in 1930, so the time frame would be correct. And the film was called Not Damaged, and it starred Walter Byron and Louis Moran. And the fact that it's called Not Damaged is brilliant, if you ask me, because the sign, whilst not actually damaged itself, is at least incomplete and missing its accompanying knot, which is nowhere to be seen. But whatever the sign was for, the photograph has gone on to be instantly memorable and recognisable. It's probably one of Walker Evans' most famous shots. In fact, if you Google Walker Evans damaged, you get 3,330,000 results, which is quite extraordinary. It's so well known, in fact, that someone online is even selling Walker Evans damaged face masks, coffee mugs, pillows and notebooks. So now you all know what to buy me for Christmas. But what I'm really interested in doing is seeing how this image in particular, this particular photograph, fits within Evans's entire career, because it's really not as straightforward as you might initially think and as it might seem. And I think this photograph, as well as being brilliant, is also a very problematic image in terms of Evans's style and his entire archive, and I'll try and explain why. So as I've already mentioned, whenever he took this image, whether it was in 1928, 29 or 30, it was a relatively early photograph for him. But it certainly hit his sweet spot. As I mentioned earlier on, his father, Walker Evans Jr., the adulterer who left his mother for the woman next door, also worked in advertising. And advertising, typography and signs in general were a lifelong obsession for his son. So when Evans took this photo, he was in his mid to late 20s and just starting out as a professional photographer. Damaged was very much one of his early successes. You can imagine it would have been an image he was proud of, and one which both helped to get him hooked on photography and drew attention to his work. It may, and I'm not 100% certain of this, but it may have also been the very first photo he ever got published, which was in this, which was a magazine called Creative Art, and this is the December 1930 issue of that, under the title Mr. Evans Records a City Scene, where it appeared under this thing, this is a calligram or a word cloud that Evans also designed. So remember, Evans described himself as a failed writer. So it's interesting to see him playing with combinations of text and images this early on in his career. And you can imagine that maybe he thought to himself, this was a future that he could do, that he could combine text and images, especially, this is a perfect image because it's an image of a bloody enormous word. So it seems to fulfill lots of his ambitions in one photograph. And it's interesting to me that he did it like this because he was clearly thinking about photography in a different way early on, even if this is something he went on to abandon. 2 years later, after it was published in that magazine, it was also included in an exhibition called Modern Photography at Home and Abroad at the very grand Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo in 1932. And then something very weird happens. In 1938, so we're going to jump forward 6 years here, Evans had a solo exhibition, which was a major solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, called Walker Evans American Photographs. And in fact, that exhibition was the first ever exhibition at the museum devoted to a single photographer. So it was a really big deal. It was about as big a deal as a deal can be for a photographer in 1938. Although interestingly, not everyone was happy about it. Ansel Adams, the great landscape photographer, here's Ansel Adams, in a photo of him struggling to keep his hat on in a high wind, was absolutely furious by the fact that Evans had been given this solo exhibition, mainly because he wanted to be the first photographer to have a first solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And Adams was bitterly disappointed and is on record as saying that he thought Evans's work and the exhibition were atrocious. But at the time, it was a very big deal. In fact, it was such a big deal that if you go to the MoMA website today, you can still find their original press release. Here it is. And in 1938, where they describe Evans as a man thought by his admirers to be one of the greatest living American photographers. It doesn't say what his detractors, like Ansel Adams, might have thought of him, but that's besides the point. Amazingly, also on this website, you can also find an itemized checklist of the exhibition. And you can see at number 82 here, it's truck and sign. So we know that this is the right photograph because there's also the exhibition hanging scheme up there, and you can see there number 82 is the damaged photograph. So there's also this great photograph of workmen actually moving stuff for the exhibition, like you and I were doing just earlier on, Casey, wherever we are. And you can see, what I love about this photograph, and I don't know who took this photograph, it might have been Evans or it might be someone else, is the angle of this sort of sculpture is the same as the angle of the damaged thing. Although maybe I'm clasping at straws there, I have absolutely no idea. But the really fascinating thing to me is this. Evans was known to be incredibly fastidious and careful about the hanging and sequencing of his work in exhibitions and books. And legend has it that he locked himself in the museum the night before it opened so that he could ensure all the images were displayed properly and exactly as he wanted. Although then he was apparently too nervous to attend the opening himself and just walk around the block several times being sick while it was happening. So anyway, we know and we can be certain that the damaged photograph was part of the exhibition at MoMA. But the really interesting thing to me is that it's not included in the accompanying book, American Photographs. This is Evans's first, most famous book, arguably, does not contain the damaged photograph. So why? You know, the exhibition had 100 photograph images. This book has 87, so 13 were cut out, and damaged was one of them. But why remove such a strong and successful photograph from your first and most well-known book? Well, maybe precisely because it was such a strong image. And I think a clue lies in a note, a memo that Evans wrote to himself in 1935, which simply reads, "No politics, whatever." Evans, as hopefully you're beginning to appreciate, was a very interesting and unique character, rather sort of slippery and hard to pin down. There he is again, looking slippery and hard to pin down. And I think he hated to be defined or categorized or thought of in a certain way. And I'll try and explain a bit more. During the Great Depression in 1935 and 36, he famously took a job working for the Farm Security Administration, a New Deal agency of the government. And there were many other photographers doing similar things, most famously Dorothea Lange, who took this iconic photograph in Nipomo, California in 1936, that has become to known as Migrant Mother, but is actually of a woman called Florence Owens Thompson, or Arthur Rothstein, there he is, who took this great image of a farmer and his children during a dust storm in Oklahoma, also in 1936. And Evans' involvement with the FSA was slightly different from most of the other photographers, and I really don't want to get sucked into a long explanation of all the several trips that he took, but it's sufficient to note that one of these expeditions was taken together with the photographer James Agee, who looks a bit like Richard Burton there, doesn't he? He looks quite a handsome man with a lot of Brill cream in his hair, but that's by the by. And he toured America and the Midwest taking photographs of sharecroppers and farmers, and in some cases actually staying with them and living in their houses. And some of these photographs, like these, have come to completely define that era. This is Allie Mae Burroughs, the wife of a sharecropper, actually not the wife of this man, and another farmer, and then here's Bud Fields with his entire family. These are all photographs taken by Evans in 1935 and 1936. So in 1941, several years after the expedition and also the exhibition in the Met, a book was published called Now Let Us Praise Famous Men, which was a combination of Agee's text and Evans's images. And it sort of came to be regarded as a groundbreaking example of political and social commentary, even though at the time it was rather shunned as being a bit too left-wing and a bit too radical. But I get the feeling that Evans was almost embarrassed by this success and by this connection, or at least by the use of his photographs as part of something that could be allied to a particular cause or even political propaganda. In the persons and places section at the start of Now Let Us Praise Famous Men, Agee describes himself as a spy travelling as a journalist, whereas Walker Evans, well, I don't know what that means actually, and Walker Evans is described as a counter-spy travelling as a photographer. And I don't really know what that means. I've read the whole of the book, all 400 pages of it, and I'm still not entirely sure. If Evans is a counter-spy, then which side is he actually working for? Let's not forget that Evans, as we've seen, came from a fairly privileged background. He certainly came from an entirely different world to the sharecroppers and tenant farmers that he and Agee were staying with and documenting. So it's possibly not unsurprising that Evans might have felt out of place in such a setting. And it's also worth, I think, having a quick look at some far, far less well-known photographs he took just before he took those images that are far more familiar from Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. So early in 1935, Evans was staying with this man, who was an acquaintance of his called Gifford Cochran. And this is a fairly blurry photo of Cochran. But Cochran, and this is on the back of a steamboat in Louisiana, Cochran was a wealthy art patron and architecture buff who had hired Evans to travel through the South with him and photograph Greek Revival architecture for a planned book on the history of the Greek Revival style in America, taking photos like this, which is a very grand Louisiana plantation house with its massive Greek columns. So this was obviously a very different commission to the trip he'd take with Agee just a year later. But it was a job, and that's also a recurrent theme in lots of Evans's work. Most of the work that Evans did, not all of it, but most of it, was work he undertook for money, and money was always short. Evans had designs possibly above his station, and he was always short of cash. And in addition to the architecture photos he took on that trip with Gifford Cochran, he also took some others, which I find absolutely fascinating. I'm going to show you some of them now. This one's here, and what are we looking at here? Well, this is a group of men by the side of the road in Louisiana. And this photo is a drive-by shot, because if you notice carefully here, that's the hood ornament of Cochran's swanky car. And here's another one, also with the hood ornament of Cochran's car in it, and another one. And there's absolutely loads of these if you go onto the website and have a look. And some of them are quite blurry, and the reason they're quite blurry is because Cochran's chauffeur, James, not Albert, for those of you who are still paying attention, but James was driving too fast. And tellingly, these shots weren't printed until the 1990s, long after Evans had died. So Evans was aware of his own contradictions and how they could be read. You know, touring the countryside in a chauffeur-driven car, snapping photos out the windows you speed past, is not a great look for someone who is also aligned with a book about an undeniably left-wing agenda such as AG's Now Let Us Praise Famous Men. And maybe that's what he meant when he described Evans as a counter-spy. I don't know, I'm just speculating. Anyway, after that massive detour, let's come back to Damaged and why it is so problematic and why I think it's not in American photographs. That the word in this shot is damaged means that this photograph can literally be read as a metaphor. So what is damaged? What is precisely damaged? Maybe it's America or society or capitalism in general. Certainly in the grip of the Depression in the 1930s, that wouldn't be such a huge leap to take, would it? And I think that Evans removed this photograph from his book because he didn't want people reading it the wrong way and thinking he was being too direct or too obvious. Remember his note to himself of no politics whatsoever. And Evans's politics were complicated and far from straightforward. He came from money, but he was always struggling for money. He was often on the fringes of high society, but he could also stay with tenant farmers in Alabama. In 1975, in a lecture he gave just 2 days before he died, he looked back at the American society in the 1930s, the decade where his photographic career took off, and he said, "It was a hateful society, and that embittered all people of my age. It was very fascist unconsciously, and all authority was almost insulting to a citizen. You either got into that parade or you got a bum treatment. I used to jump for joy when I read of those stockbrokers jumping out of windows." So I think that Damaged, the photograph, is complicated because it can possibly be read as a political statement from Evans. And certainly back in the 30s, he didn't want to be tied to either side directly. Now I should point out I have no idea whether I'm correct here. And Evans, as far as I can tell, never once commented directly on this photograph, or at least he didn't in any of the numerous books and interviews that I've read. It's not, as far as I can see, discussed in any of his many biographies or the several books by acquaintances of his where they also relay multiple other stories about him and the things he would get up to. And it might simply be that there's nothing to tell. You know, if you're a photographer, then you'll know that sometimes you just happen across stuff. You take a photo, or in this case 2 or 3, and then you walk on and that's it. But to me, the lack of discussion about this damaged photo is very telling. There's even an entire book called Walker Evans' Signs, which features a lengthy essay by someone called Andrei Codrescu, which goes into extensive details on dozens of Evans' photographs of signs that he took across his entire life. But the book doesn't even feature Damaged either. It's as if it's been removed or completely ignored. And this is both baffling and intriguing to me. Signs to Evans were a constant, lifelong obsession. Evans was a collector as well as a photographer, and he fully acknowledged that the two activities are fundamentally almost the same thing. He would talk about falling in love with a certain kind of object and pursuing it and then capturing it on film. And the Walker Evans archive at the Met Museum runs to over 9,000 items, most of which are photos and contact sheets, but also includes 143 items of ephemera, which are mainly signs, wooden, metal and tin signs that Evans himself personally liberated or stole, in the same way that I stole this postcard of his, on his numerous trips across the country. Imagine that you've seen lots of signs that Walker Evans stole on his trips across the thing, and then this is one of them. And this is one of the ones I like because it says, "Please don't sit around the house in your bathing suit," which I very much like. And even though I want to talk about signs for a bit, this is also the perfect time to tell you a quick and hilarious story that I found in this huge book, which is called, one of the biggest books out there on Walker Evans, called Walker Evans' Depth of Field, in which John T. Hill tells a story that was told to him by John Szarkowski, who's a famous photographer and curator. This is a Polaroid of John Szarkowski taken by Evans in 1973. But a few years earlier than this, not long after they'd first met, Szarkowski, who was a good 20 years younger than Evans and had always been a huge fan of his work, invited Evans to his house for Christmas dinner. And soon after Evans arrived, Szarkowski proudly showed him a present that his wife had just given him, which was a very handsome antique Victorian wooden case containing an entire alphabet of large wooden stamps. Big mistake. You can probably guess where this is going. Evans looked at the case and its contents closely, told Szarkowski how much he liked it, and then they all sat down to Christmas dinner. And then afterwards, at the end of the evening, as he was leaving, Evans casually tucked the box under his arm, told Szarkowski that he couldn't help himself, and stole it. And Sarkowski, because he was so in awe of Evans, allowed this thing to happen. It's quite astonishing. And it wasn't till years later, after Evans died, that the box, in 1975, that he got the box back. To me, this is just astonishing. So you can see that me stealing Evans's postcard was perfectly in tune with his own behaviour. And incidentally, he had a collection of 9,000 postcards, many of which he'd stolen, although that last bit might be a lie. So I might go off on a brief tangent here, but one of my favourite quotes by John Sarkowski is when he said, one might compare the art of photography to the act of pointing. It must be true that some of us point to more interesting facts, events, circumstances and configurations than others. And I love this quote, and I think it's particularly applicable to Evans, who always had a very direct, unfussy photographic style that was certainly akin to pointing at stuff. And he was also very fond of pointing and taking pictures of signs of fingers pointing. So here is a great one he took in Ohio in 1947, or this one here. And they tie in very nicely and amusingly with a quote of Evans's own, when he said that, I used to try and figure out precisely what I was seeing all the time until I discovered I didn't need to. If the thing is there, why, there it is. Which is both true when you look at what he referred to as his vernacular or simple, unadorned photographic style, but also rather ironic because in the case of Walker Evans, especially in his later life, the truth was that if the thing is there, especially if it was a sign, quite often after taking his photograph, he would actually go and steal it. So it wouldn't be there anymore. So anyway, Evans took or stole these numerous signs with numerous different companions or accomplices, one of whom was the photographer and artist William Christianbury, who you can see here. Is that coming out properly? I don't know why that's so pixelated. Sorry about that. Who stole all these signs behind him. And they used to try and outdo each other in their sign-stealing escapades when they would travel around the country with a toolkit and a can of liquid wrench, whatever that is. But ultimately, though, Christianbury would usually win out because he was the fitter man. He was younger by Evans by about 30 years. And in his late 60s and 70s, Evans was in very ill, failing health. Here's a great photo of Evans taken by Jerry Thompson in 1973 that sort of shows how frail he had become walking with a stick. And this was after having most of his stomach removed in an operation that severely restricted his movement and ability. And Evans compromised from being able to steal signs by photographing them with a Polaroid SX70. He used one of these, which means he could instantly transform a sign into a photograph and then take that away. So here he is, age 70, photographing some painted signage on the road, and then here is the photo that you could see him taking there. Another great example of this is the case of a palmist sign in the window of a building in Havana Junction, Alabama, that both Evans and Christianbury photographed in 1974. So here's Evans's Polaroid of that sign, and here's Christianbury's photo of Evans taking that Polaroid. And then here's Christianbury's 8x10 photograph of that sign. And finally, here's the same sign liberated on the wall in Christianbury's studio. So what's that famous phrase again? All art is theft? Anyway, Evans went on photographing signs in ephemera right up until the age of 1972 when he died of at the age of 72 when he died of a stroke in 1975. This is a photo of his house taken in the year that he died. And you can see there's various signs and trophies mounted on the walls. Although honestly, I think that this was a tidied up version of reality taken by another photographer, because there are a couple of Polaroids taken by Evans of the parts of his house that weren't on general public display. So this is his bedroom, which is a glorious mess. Apparently, I think I might have mentioned earlier on, he never threw away a single thing or a single piece of paper that he'd ever written on. And here's his bathroom sink, which, I mean, you can see there's a death trap. There's a hairdryer on the side, and there's a sign in the middle that says, "Please do not disturb the arrangement of tin beer caps in this wash bowl." So he collected tin beer caps that he would find on the floor. So as you can see, signage and typography and broken discarded things were items that were close to Walker Evans's heart throughout his entire life. And he even joked that he was the true father of pop art, in that his obsession and recognition of the artistry and beauty of everyday mass-produced objects and signs easily predated Warhol and other more famous pop artists of the 50s and 60s. There's Evans' ice cream Polaroid, there's Andy Warhol's famous soup can. But obviously, as we've already seen, Evans's obsession with signs goes back to the late 1920s and early 30s. These are some other early photographs that he took. And just one final anecdote before we get back to the damage thing, I promise, and move on to something else. But this is something I only found out very recently, but I think it's very funny and directly linked to what we've been talking about. because it wasn't only signs and antique boxes of wooden alphabet stamps that Evans stole or had removed. This is another one of his more famous photographs, which is Joe's Auto Graveyard near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, taken in 1936. And this is an image which, unlike Damaged, made it into American photographs and can be read possibly as a very subtle comment on Henry T. Ford's much vaunted production line efficiency. All those new cars have to end up somewhere, and whilst they were new and fast once, they all end up rotting away like a parody of the car showroom. But when I was doing research for this talk, I came across this photo of Evans by Arnold Crane again, who photographed many famous photographers, and saw Evans out late in life. And this photograph was taken in 1969, so about 33 years later after this photograph. And if you didn't know anything else about this photograph, you might think that here we have Walker Evans, who is still looking at rotten cars and maybe contemplating another American vernacular photo. But that's not the whole story. The truth behind this photo is that Evans is not out on one of his photographic road trips. This photograph was taken when he was living in Old Lyme, Connecticut, when he was teaching at Yale University. Here's a photograph of his house, taken from outside. This is a photograph by Evans of his own house. And this photograph here was, actually have I done that again? Yeah, this photograph here was actually taken in his specially constructed wrecked car garden, which was a lot directly opposite this house, where he'd have wrecked cars that he'd found while out and about, brought and arranged so that he could look at them at his leisure and then take photographs of them. And apparently he was very proud of this endeavour, and it would give him many hours of pleasure to stand there, hands on hips, contemplating mortality, life and whatnot. And he took photos of the found cars that he'd had brought there, and here's two of those photographs for your perusal and enjoyment. This is one, which was taken on medium format, and then this second extraordinary photograph, which was taken on a Polaroid of a rotting car in his wrecked car garden. And this fact, this detail, to me, could only be more perfect if, in addition to these wrecked cars, he'd somehow specially moved to rot in the lot just across from his house. If he'd somehow also been able to locate and transport that brand new damaged sign, which was rotting, but unfortunately that didn't happen. But I want to return to this sign just for one more thing, and now that you know a lot more, possibly too much about it, and Evans' subsequent life and career, and I want us to look at it yet again, and maybe now we can start to appreciate what it might have meant to Walker Evans. So we know he had a lifelong fascination with signs, and here is one of the biggest signs you'll ever see. We know that he couldn't really help himself when it came to taking souvenirs. He was a collector, or to put it more bluntly, a thief. And just as I stole the postcard of this image, so Evans stole countless objects, many of them signs. Although I should point out that he never referred to it as stealing, because that would be far too crude a word for Evans to use. He actually preferred the term lifting. I've added the exclamation mark there. Lifting, because obviously that glosses over or dresses up what he was really doing. And it also implies that by selecting something for his attention, either by photographing it or taking it or frequently both, he was lifting or elevating its importance. It's no longer just an old sign or a junked car. It's Evans's eye, his pointing, his blessing, or his appropriation has lifted or transformed it to the status of art. And he was 100% conscious of this process. In an interview, he once said, most people would look at those things and say, well, that's nothing. What did you do that for? That's just a wreck of a car or a wreck of a man. That's nothing. That isn't art. They don't say that anymore. And Evans was one of the people who, during the 20th century, transformed the way that we look at our world, and he knew it. And Damaged was one of his earliest attempts at this lifting, doubly so, as it's a sign actually being physically lifted, as well as being lifted or elevated by his selection. And there's a gorgeous continuity to all this as well. Damaged was one of his earliest successful photos, and then 40 years later, he's still doing it. He's still photographing signs and still lifting them, both physically and metaphorically. And when he can't physically lift them, he can now instantly convert them into Polaroid photographs, objects that he can then make off with. But there's just one final thing, honest, before I move on to something else, that I want to say about this photograph, and it also ties in, I think, to why it wasn't included in American photographs, and why it also seems to be so absent from any scholarly analysis of Evans's work in general. And it's something that took me a good while to appreciate, but now I think I begin to appreciate it, and it's this. So even though this photograph is of a sign being lifted, and Walker Evans spent his life obsessed with signs and also frequently lifted them, I want to suggest that this photograph is not, absolutely not, a typical Walker Evans photograph. And why is that? Can anyone hazard a guess at why this isn't a typical Walker Evans photograph? The thing it's showing us here, the incident that it's portraying, is unusual. And it's not typical at all. What we're not seeing here is a sign in its natural environment. It's not atop a building or a billboard or even rotting in a junkyard. What we're seeing here is a thing that isn't usually seen. This photo is more of a decisive moment. This is more of an Henri Cartier-Bresson, if you want to use that type event. It's a street photograph, and even though Evans took plenty of what could be broadly termed street photographs, like this is one of his, or this, he almost never took photographs of strange or unusual events, like this. Evans was all about the vernacular, about the everyday, and whilst on the one hand this event was an everyday event for the people that work for the Globe Electric Sign Corps, as a photograph it's transformed into something else. It is indeed lifted, but lifted to something that Evans knew, even at that early point in his career, wouldn't fit snugly as part of his artistic vision and legacy. So that's one photograph that I think it's fascinating to look at in great detail, possibly too great detail, I don't know. But it has ramifications across the whole of his long career. And if we've got the time, and if anyone has the stamina, there's a couple of others that I can also talk about, or I can just stop there, it's up to you.
Keep going.
Do you want me to carry on? Okay, I'll carry on. Honestly, it's not as long as what I've just done, I promise you. So towards the end of his life, as I've touched upon briefly, Evans had his photographic passion reignited by working in colour with a Polaroid camera. Here he is. It's one of these, and here you can see him photographing one of his beloved signs. This is another Lee Freelander photograph, and this is the photograph that Evans was taking, this West End Dead Street Do Not Enter. But it wasn't only signs that Evans captured late on with his new tool, the Polaroid SX70. Here is a Polaroid, that one of many that Evans took, of Lee Freelander. This is Lee Freelander in 1973. I should point out that Polaroid provided Evans with free film as much as he wanted, right up until his death in 1975. So in those 2 years between him first getting a Polaroid in 1973 and him dying in 1975, he took over 2,500 Polaroids, and the vast majority of these were of signs and trashed cars and things that he had in his wrecked car garden across the street from his house. But many, many more were of friends and students and anyone who sort of strayed into his orbit. Here's a photograph of him photographing someone called Susan Thornton. And try as I might, I have not been able to find the corresponding Polaroid that we can see Evans taking here. It might have been given away. He often gave them as gifts to the subject. Or it might have turned out to be a bit rubbish. As anyone who's shot with a Polaroid knows, they can occasionally muck up spectacularly. In fact, briefly coming back to Evans' own usage of the word lifted in regard to his work, it also amuses me greatly that the Met Museum, which owns the great, vast Evans archive, is obliged to catalogue absolutely every bloody thing that Evans ever shot. And so that, in that case, that means that also numerous Polaroids like this, which have to be catalogued and on the thing as unidentifiable, blurred and abstract form. When in fact all they are ruined, faulty and useless Polaroids. But because Evans never threw anything away, and because it was the great Walker Evans that pressed the button that resulted in this spoiled image, they have been saved and lifted, preserved forever as art, and most definitely not as rubbish, which is a situation I think Walker Evans himself would have found quite funny. However, he did take lots of successful Polaroid photographs and portraits, and whilst a lot of people find them not to rank above his greatest work, I find them fascinating. So here is a grid that I have made of Evans's Polaroids from 1973, 4 and a bit of 5, all taken shortly before he died. This is just a tiny fraction of what he took, and I cannot tell you how long it took me to make this grid. It was absolute torture, but I'm glad I did it because it's very helpful to illustrate the point I want to go and try and make, which is this. Just as Evans in later life returned to his constant theme and interest in signs and signage, the vernacular detritus, if you want to get all fancy about it, of America, so he also returned to an interest in the human face. And I think this interest in the human face is possibly a bit overlooked when we think about Walker Evans' work. His best known work, I think it's fair to say, is his sign, architecture and building photographs. And if we think of his portrait work, then it tends to be the very piercing and clear portraits he took when he was with James Agee, those photographs I showed you earlier, like this. And it's undeniably true that these photographs are crisp and powerful, and mainly that's because they were shot on medium format and we know their true context. These are photographs of people in the midst of the Great Depression. Evans has captured something of their resilience and their spirit in these shots, and that's what makes them great. They've become iconic. Whereas these later Polaroid portraits, taken almost 40 years later, are entirely different, and we're not sure of the context that they were taken in. These people, although some of them are famous, aren't suffering or enduring the Great Depression, and that makes these images somehow less serious or worthy. They're not quite lifted as much, even though they've also been taken by Evans. But the other reason I've spent hours arranging them like this is that they remind me of some other Evans photographs, and I think it's worth comparing them to. First of all, there's this amazing shot, which is a photography studio window. The photograph's title was Penny Picture Display, Savannah, 1936. And it's significant, I think, that this photograph was the second photograph in American Photographs, Evans' most well-known and important book. The first photograph was this, on the left, which is a photography studio in New York, taken in 1943, and you can see there's some of his beloved pointing sign things down at the bottom. And then this studio photograph is the second photograph on the following page. And so Evans was stating very clearly from the off that this was a book of photographs, photographs of America. And one of the things he was interested in, and continued to be interested in, was faces. Whether they were anonymous people in the penny picture display, or 40 years later, friends and acquaintances captured by his miraculous cutting-edge new Polaroid technology that he got filmed for free for because he was the great Walker Evans. And I don't think it mattered to him too much which one of those things he was using. He was satisfying his artistic impulse and his curiosity to create in any way that he could. But it's not just the photo studio window that the late Polaroids bring to mind. Evans had another early project that I also want to quickly look at, which also fits very well with this late flourish. So in 1938, after his solo exhibition at the Met, the one that didn't include damage that did include damage that we talked about earlier on, Evans began another project that he kept up for the next 3 years, and at the time was something very different for him, and also something that was quite groundbreaking. Up until then, he'd mainly, not always, but mainly been using a large format camera for much of his work. Here's a picture of him using his large format camera. That apparently is Evans under that thing. It might not be, but we don't know. It could be absolutely anyone. But in 1938, he came up with another idea, an idea that would involve the use of a much smaller camera to take photographs not of buildings, but of faces. And this was his project on the New York subway. And the photos that I'm about to show you in a minute were all taken between 1938 and 1941, but they didn't actually see the light of day until much later in 1966, when 80 of them were gathered together in this book called Many Are Called, which, as you can see, came with a foreword from Evans' old collaborator, James Agee. Here's one of the photographs from that book, a great shot looking down the carriage of a blind accordion player being almost totally ignored by all of his fellow passengers except by Evans. And if you only saw this photograph from the project, then you might be forgiven that thinking Evans' subway work is very much in the tradition of countless other photographers who have done projects on trains in New York. These photographs, this one here, this one here, anyone know who took these? These were all taken by Stanley Kubrick, who was only 19 at the time, and he took them in 1947. Here's Stanley Kubrick in 1947. So several years after Evans' project, when Kubrick was a full-time photographer for Look magazine. And here's a couple of double-page spreads from Look magazine showing Kubrick's essay, which was called Life and Love on the New York Subway. And remember, even though Evans has completed his subway project 6 years earlier, hardly anyone had seen it. It never got published. And Kubrick obviously wasn't the only photographer who's worked underground. Almost anyone you can think of who's a decent photographer has done it. So this is a Gary Winogrand photo from the 1960s. This is a Bruce Davison photograph from his fantastic book Subway in the 1980s. Richard Sandler, and more recently Andre D. Wagner has produced a book called Here for the Ride, and this was as recently as 2017. And that's just the tip of an enormous iceberg of an entire genre of subway photos, really. But Evans' work predates them all. He was the first person to really do it. And not only that, but his project is still incredibly different and distinctive. I showed you this photograph first because it's unusual. It's not typical of the work that eventually made it into Many Are Called. Every other photo that is included in that book looks like this. Or this. Or this. And it's important to understand how Evans was taking these photographs and what his intention was in order to fully appreciate quite how radical this project was and remains. So remember, way back, what must seem like several lifetimes ago now, I showed you this photograph, which was taken by Helen Levitt. There she is. And this is Helen Levitt on the subway, taken by Evans, very much in the style of the photograph that Evans was taking for his entire project. Levitt was Evans's darkroom assistant for a while, and he also took her out with him when he made these excursions to shoot on subway trains. He got a Guggenheim grant to do this. Of course he did. He was the great Walker Evans who just had a show at the Met, which described him as one of the most important photographers alive. But I think it's quite funny to see what he got up to next, which is he would get on the subway with Helen Levitt, and she would sit next to him, and he would have his camera, which was, I think, a little Contax 35mm camera, and he wore a thick, heavy coat with the camera hidden underneath and the lens just poking out through a gap in between the two buttons. And he had a shutter cable release up his arm, and he'd have Helen Levitt next to him, and he'd pretend to be talking to her so she could act as his decoy, and then he would photograph the fellow passengers that were sitting opposite him, which is why all the photographs, apart from this one, look like this. And there's a fantastic conformity here. This is almost a formal art project. Evans is trying to capture faces of normal, everyday people with their guard down. He described them as the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, his idea of what a portrait ought to be, anonymous and documentary and a straightforward picture of mankind. Incidentally, the fact that he had Helen Levitt with him while he was taking these photographs is also very funny to me, not just because she was also a great photographer, but being deployed, in this case, just as a decoy. And it's also worth noting that Levitt took her own photographs while she was down there with Evans, although I don't know if she had a similar sneaky setup with a shutter release down the arm of her coat. Here are a couple of hers. That's one of hers, and that's one of hers. But the main reason I find this quite funny is that many years later, in 1966, the same year when Evans published Many Are Called, Evans wrote a little essay called Random Notes and Suggestions for Photographers, which is the thing he did for his photography students at Yale. And here it is, and you probably can't read it, so I'll read it out. And it's a list of useful points, many of which are technical about camera shutter speeds and the importance of wearing gloves when out shooting in cold weather. But finally, towards the end, he ends on this point, which says, work alone if you can. Girls are particularly distracting, and if you want to concentrate, you have to. This is not anti-feminism, it is common sense. Companions you may be with, unless perfectly patient and slavish to your genius, are bored stiff with what you're doing. This will make itself felt and ruin your concentrated, sustained purpose. So I have no idea whether he felt that Helen Levitt was a particular distraction on their subway shooting expeditions together, or if indeed whether or not she was slavish enough to his genius or bored stiff with what he was doing. But it's funny now to take another look at this photo he took of her on the subway and see how she looks. Does she seem perfectly patient, or slavish to his genius, or bored stiff, or a combination of all three? But however Helen Levitt felt about this project, Evans himself was obviously very fond of it. He felt it, to use his own term, had a sustained purpose. And even though the book was eventually published in 1966 and came with a rather pretentious foreword by James Agee, Evans himself did a lot of writing about it, which helps to reveal his intentions and hopes for the project. First of all, he gave reference to the kind of thing he was aiming for when he wrote an essay called The Unposed Portrait in 1940, which says, the crashing non-euphoria of a New York subway life may some way be recorded by a modern Dickens or Daumier. The setting is sociological goldmine awaiting a major artist. Meanwhile, it can be the dream location for any portrait photographer wary of the studio and the horrors of vanity. Down in this swaying sweatbox, he finds a parade of unself-conscious captive sitters, the selection of which is automatically destined by raw chance. And this is a very revealing bit of text, because it contains some false modesty when he talks about a modern-day goldmine awaiting a major artist. Of course, the man who had just had a show at the Met and been described as one of the best living photographers would never think of himself as a major artist, would he? Of course not. And then he references a writer, Charles Dickens, who we all know, and then an artist, a French artist, Honoré Daumier. Now, not everyone nowadays might know Daumier. He lived between 1808 and 1879. Here's a photo of him from around 1850, looking slightly dishevelled and possibly hungover after a big night out. And Daumier was mainly famous for his caricatures of modern-day French life. He was like a French Hogarth, and his main topic was the masses, ordinary people and their faces. This is a great Daumier sketch of the audience at a theatre. But what he also did was a whole series of sketches of passengers on the Paris omnibus, like this, and this, And once you've seen those sketches from almost 100 years earlier, it's hard not to think of them when we go back and look at Evans's subway photos from early 1940. That bloke even looks French. So now maybe we can start to appreciate exactly what Evans was aiming for when he took Helen Levitt down to the subway with him and hid a camera under his coat. Remember, he also wrote about how the subway could be the dream location for any portrait photographer wary of the studio and the horrors of vanity. Now, I'm not sure whether he was thinking of his earlier photo from Savannah in 1936. Evans was never a studio portrait photographer. That's one branch of the art that he managed to avoid, unlike his fellow FSA photographer Dorothea Lange, who started her career as a portrait photographer in San Francisco in the 1920s. But I find it telling that Evans mentions the horrors of vanity. Vanity is not a word much associated with Evans's imagery. His work is far more about naturalism, documentary, and the effects of time and history both upon objects and people. Consider this photograph of Floyd Burroughs from 1936. This might be posed, but it is a portrait that speaks volumes about the hardship that this man, this farmer, endured during the Great Depression. There's nothing vain about it. And this is where Evans excels. He's detached enough to record history and the people that are living through it. He famously said that he had an interest in what any present time will look like as the past, which is completely applicable to his work, although it's also applicable to the work of any photographer. Photographer, by its very nature, is a way of capturing the past. And these people in the New York subway that are now very distant to us, but when were these photographs taken? They were taken between 1938 and 1941, when the world was rapidly sliding into World War II. So it's by no means a stretch to think that these photos are not only not vain, posed portraits, but the people in them, New Yorkers, many of whom might have fled Europe themselves, or certainly have friends and family caught up in the fighting, might be preoccupied and thinking about what was going on across the Atlantic. That's almost certainly what they would have been reading about in their newspapers, or thinking about while they hugged their children. So it's not the horrors of vanity that Evans went down into the subway to record. It was a different kind of horror. But also, let's not forget, Evans's own credo, his slogan of no politics whatever. Remember, this is the reason I think he removed damage from American photographs. His real aversion to being thought of as having anything in common or as crude as a clear political message. As common or as crude as a clear political message. In none of the 7 or 8 pieces of text that Evans wrote about his subway photographs does he ever mention the Second World War, or exactly what these subjects might have been thinking about. Evans never once explicitly says, here's a man reading about the horrors of the Second World War, but that knowledge, the context and history can't help but colour our perception of it all these years later when we look at these images of the past. And what's really interesting to me is that in the late 1950s, so when these photographs were over a decade old, Evans came back to them and prepared a mock-up or a maquette for a book he wanted to call The Passengers. But he knew that if he included photographs like this one, then it might be problematic, because you can read the headline here, Kennedy Fights Aid Britain Bill. Well, that provides us with some context, doesn't it? It dates the photograph and the politics begin to creep in. So what did he do? What Evans did was he started to crop. He turned his original photographs into images like this, and this, and then he did this. Now, he turned them into a grid, and surely I'm not the only one here who can see a deliberate echo of his earlier famous photograph from American photographs here. Actually, maybe it's better if we place them side by side. So on the left, we have the posed studio portraits from Savannah in 1936, the photographs that Evans obliquely referred to as illustrating the horrors of vanity. And then on the right, we have the photographs he took just 5 or so years later in the New York subway. Portraits without any vanity of people with their guards down, completely unaware of the fact that they're being photographed, lost in thought, possibly about the horrors of war. And I think these two images make for a very powerful juxtaposition. They're a reflection on America and on photography and how we see ourselves. And here, incidentally, is Evans's original mock-up of the cover for that volume that didn't find a publisher in the 1950s. And like I said, it wasn't until 1966 that Many Are Called was published in a more conventional layout with the photos shown in their original aspect ratio. And it wasn't until just the other day before I came out that I realised something else that this mock-up of Evans's reminded me of. Because not only did his cropping and cutting of those subway passengers from the early 1940s obviously put me in mind of his studio window from 1936. But there was another earlier body of work that it also called to mind, and that was Evans's self-portraits that he started taking in the late 1920s. And I've dotted a few of these through the talk thus far, like this creepy blurred one from 1927, or there's this more complete, more stylish strip from 1929. And there are loads more. Again, if you go to the Met Museum's website, you can find dozens and dozens of them, and they're all labelled from automated photo booths in New York City when Evans had got back from Europe and when he was very much falling in love with photography as a medium and just playing around with this new technology. So because he never threw anything away, and remember we still have photographs like this which were disposable and throwaway at the time and never meant to endure, but have, and Evans kept on doing this throughout his life. So these ones are from a photo booth in 1929, while this one here is from a photo booth in 1970. And then, as we know, by the 1970s, Evans was also using Polaroids. And so whilst these aren't technically selfies, because someone else would have had to have been pressing the shutter, they're almost all with his camera. And it's fascinating to me that 40 years later, Evans is still playing about with instant film and having photographs taken of him like this. So if someone wanted to, and they had the time, they could even amalgamate all these self-portraits together until you have yet another grid, like this. And these are all photographs of Walker Evans. You might remember, if you can still think back that far, that at the very start of this lecture, I said I could have done the entire thing on photographs just of Walker Evans. But when I said that originally, I didn't fully appreciate how those portraits would effectively fit in with and conveniently bookend his photographic career. There are photographs in this grid here spanning 46 years. And this grid, I think, speaks to these two grids. One of these is people Evans had never met, photographs taken by some anonymous commercial photographer in Savannah, and then the others are all people he didn't properly look at on the subway, and then onto this grid of Polaroids of his friends and students at Yale right at the end of his life in the 1970s. Throughout his life, Evans was always looking at people and himself, and people were also always looking at him. And I want to end, you'll be relieved to hear, finally with one last quote from Walker Evans, and it's probably one of his most famous quotes, but I'm going to read you the entire thing because usually it's lifted out of context. But he wrote all this specifically about his Subway Portrait series, and it goes right back to what I was talking about again right at the very start, when in 1926, after Walker Evans had begged his father enough that he got to visit Europe and Paris, although he had to go with his mother. And when he was there, that's when he really started to learn how to look. And this is what he wrote about that years later under the title People Anonymous. And I'll read this out, don't worry. In America, people do not look at each other publicly much. The well-bred consider it staring and therefore bad form, and they just aren't curious. An exception is the definitely rude going over one gets as a stranger in a small western town, sometimes southern, but that is a different matter. I remember my first experience as a cafe sitter in Europe. There is staring that startles the American. I tried to analyse it and came out with the realisation that the European interested is really interested in just ordinary people and makes a study of man with his eyes in public. What a pleasure and art it was to stare back, and a relief to me as a young, more or less educated American, with still echoing in the mind his mother's "don't stare, I still cannot point at anything in public," which I find hard to believe given his propensity for stealing or lifting things and his love of photographing pointing signs, but let's keep going. But I stare and stare at people shamelessly. I got my license at the Deux Magots, dated 1926. The Deux Magots, incidentally, is this famous literary cafe in Paris where Evans would sit and stare at people. Anyway, he continues, I got my license at the Deux Magots, dated 1926, where one escaped one's mother in several senses, all good too. In passing, consider the upright American father's horror at cafe sitting. And now finally we come to the bit that everyone quotes. Stare, it is the way to educate your eye and more. Stare, pry, listen, eavesdrop, die knowing something, you are not here long. And that I think is a good point to end on as any, especially as you've now been here for very long now. But I hope at least you can leave or indeed die knowing something, maybe even a few things that you didn't know before about Walker Evans. So thank you very much for coming.